My name is Grace Morrison, and I am 33 years old, and 2 weeks ago I sat in the law office of Henderson and Associates in downtown Seattle and listened to my stepmother Lydia and my two stepsisters Claire and Simone scream at the estate. Attorney, while he calmly explained that my father's will left them nothing. Not the house, not the investments, not the business, not a single dollar, and everything, including the $8.4 million estate, went solely to me and Lydia. Said this is fraud, and the attorney said, Mrs. Morrison, the will was updated 6 months ago with 2 witnesses and a notary, and your husband was completely sound of mind. And Claire said she manipulated him, and the attorney said there's actually a video recording your husband made explaining his decision. Would you like to see it? And the room went silent, and he turned on the screen, and my father's face appeared, and he said, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and Lydia and the girls are probably very upset. And I need everyone in this room to understand something. I knew exactly what I was doing. And I'm leaving everything to Grace because she's the only one who ever treated me like I mattered. And I watched my stepfamily's faces crumble, and I realized this revenge was never mine. I was just finishing what my father started. Let me take you back, because this story doesn't begin with me. It begins with my father, who married my mother when I was 2 years old, and my mother was the woman who cleaned his office building, and he fell in love with her because she was kind and funny and made him feel like a person instead of a bank account. And they got married quietly, and his family was horrified because she was working class and she didn't come from money. And when I was 7 years old, my mother died in a car accident, and my father was so broken he could barely function, and for 3 years, it was just the two of us, and we were enough. When I was 10, my father married Lydia, who came from old money and had 2 daughters from her previous marriage, and Lydia was everything my mother wasn't. She was polished and connected and knew how to navigate the social circles my father belonged to, but never cared about. And I remember the first time Lydia introduced me to her friends at a charity event. She said, this is Grace. She's my husband's daughter. And her friend said, oh, how lovely. And Lydia said, well, she's not really ours. She's the nanny's kid. And I was standing right there, and I heard it. And my father was across the room talking to someone else. And I looked at Lydia, and she smiled at me. And I realized she'd said it loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that no one would call her on it, and that was the beginning of 20 years of being reminded that I didn't belong. My stepsisters Claire and Simone were 12 and 14 when our parents got married, and from day one they treated me like I was staff. Lydia would introduce them as her daughters and me as Grace. And when people would ask if I was her daughter, too, she'd say, well, technically, but it's complicated. And she'd leave it at that, and people would nod, and I'd stand there wondering what was complicated about the fact that my father loved my mother and I was their child. Every family event was a reminder that I was different. Claire's Sweet 16 was at a country club, and I wasn't allowed to bring friends because Lydia said it was for family and close friends only. And when I asked my father why I couldn't invite anyone, he said, Grace, please don't make this harder. And I said, harder for who? And he said, for everyone, and I stopped asking. Simone's graduation party was at our house, and I spent the whole day setting up because Lydia said I should help. And when guests arrived, Lydia introduced Simone as our graduate and me as my husband's daughter from his first marriage. And someone said, oh, where's your mother? And Lydia said she passed away, and the person said, I'm so sorry, and looked at me with pity. And Lydia said, yes, it was very sad. Anyway, Simone is going to Yale. Isn't that wonderful? And the conversation moved on, and I was erased. When I graduated high school, my father threw me a small dinner at a restaurant, and Lydia and the girls didn't come because Lydia said they had a prior commitment. And my father looked tired and sad and said, I'm proud of you, Grace. And I said, no, Dad. And he said, I wish your mother was here. And I said, me too. And we sat there in a half-empty restaurant, and I felt like I was watching my father choose between keeping the peace and defending me, and the peace kept winning. I went to college on a partial scholarship, and I worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, and my father offered to pay, but I said no because I didn't want to owe Lydia anything. And every time I came home for holidays, Lydia would make comments about how I was doing things the hard way, and how Claire and Simone never had to work during school because they focused on their studies. And I'd smile and say, I'm proud of what I'm doing. And she'd say, of course you are. And she'd say it in a way that made it sound like I was naive. After college, I moved to Portland and I worked in nonprofit development, and I built a career I was proud of. And I visited my father maybe 4 times a year. And every time I visited, Lydia would say something like, oh, Grace is here, and she'd say it like I was a distant relative who showed up unannounced. And my father would hug me and say, I'm glad you're home, and I'd stay for 2 days and leave, and that was our relationship for 10 years. Then my father got sick. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and given 6 months. And I quit my job and I moved back to Seattle and I stayed with him. And Lydia said, Grace, you don't need to do this. We have nurses. And I said, I want to be here. And she said, well, don't get in the way. And I spent 6 months taking care of my father while Lydia and the girls visited for an hour a day and talked about their plans and their problems and then left. And my father would hold my hand and say, you're just like your mother. And I'd say, I hope so. And he'd say, I'm sorry, Grace. And I'd say, for what? And he'd say, for not protecting you. And I'd say, Dad, it's okay. And he'd say, it's not okay. And then he'd fall asleep. 2 weeks before he died, my father asked to speak to his attorney privately, and the attorney came to the house and they talked for an hour. And when the attorney left, my father called me into his room and said, Grace, I need you to trust me. And I said, I do. And he said, I've made some decisions, and when I'm gone, you're going to understand why. And I said, Dad, what are you talking about? And he said, just trust me. And I said, okay. My father passed away on a Monday in March, and I was holding his hand, and Lydia and the girls were in the living room. And when I told them he was gone, Lydia cried in a way that seemed performative, and Claire and Simone looked sad but also relieved, like they could finally stop pretending to care. And the funeral was 2 days later, and it was full of people I didn't know. And Lydia stood at the front accepting condolences like she was the only one who'd lost him. And I sat in the back and I felt alone. The will reading was scheduled for 1 week later. And Lydia said to me before we went in, Grace, I know your father loved you, and I'm sure he left you something meaningful. And I said, okay. And she said, I just want you to know that whatever happens, we're still family. And I said, are we? And she looked at me sharply and said, what does that mean? And I said, you've spent 20 years calling me the nanny's kid, Lydia. I don't think you get to decide we're family now. And she said, you're being dramatic. And I said, I'm being honest. And we walked into the attorney's office. The attorney read the will. And when he got to the part about the estate going entirely to me, Lydia interrupted and said, that can't be right. And the attorney said, it's very right. Mrs. Morrison and Claire said, our father wouldn't do this. And the attorney said, he's not your father, he's your stepfather. And Simone said, this is insane. Grace must have manipulated him. And the attorney said, I have a video, and he played it. And my father appeared on the screen, and he said, I'm making this video because I know Lydia and her daughters are going to contest this will. And I want to explain my decision clearly. I have spent 20 years watching my wife and stepdaughters treat my daughter Grace like she was less than them because her mother was a cleaning woman, and I allowed it because I was a coward. And I thought keeping the peace was more important than defending my child, and I was wrong. And I can't undo the damage I've done, but I can make sure Grace is taken care of, and I'm leaving her everything because she's the one who stayed when I was dying. She's the one who held my hand. She's the one who reminds me of the woman I loved most in this world. And Lydia, if you're watching this, you knew exactly what you were doing every time you called Grace the nanny's kid, and I knew it too, and I documented it. And the attorney has recordings. And I paused the video and I said, wait, recordings? And the attorney said, yes, your father recorded conversations for the past 3 years. And he pulled out a file and he said he wanted to make sure his decision was protected, and he played an audio clip, and it was Lydia's. Lydia's voice saying to someone at a party, oh, Grace isn't really family, she's just Richard's obligation. And then another clip of Claire saying, I don't know why Dad keeps pretending she matters. And another of Simone saying she's the nanny's kid, she doesn't belong here, and my father had recorded all of it and kept it as evidence, and I realized he hadn't been passively allowing it, he'd been documenting it and planning this. The attorney said your father updated his will 6 months ago and left very specific instructions that Lydia would receive nothing and Claire and Simone would receive nothing. And the house, the investments, the business, all of it goes to Grace. And if anyone contests the will, these recordings will be submitted to the court. And Lydia stood up and said, "This is cruel." And I said, "No, Lydia. Cruel is spending 20 years making me feel like I didn't belong. Cruel is calling me the nanny's kid at every event. Cruel is erasing my mother. Like she didn't matter, and my father knew all of it, and he chose me." And she said, "You poisoned him against us." And I said, "I didn't have to. You did that yourselves." And they walked out. I inherited everything. The house in Seattle, the investment portfolio, the small but profitable consulting business my father had built, and I sold the house because I didn't want to live somewhere that held 20 years of bad memories. And I kept the business, and I hired someone to run it. And I used part of the money to start a scholarship fund for students whose parents work in service industries, and I named it after my mother, and I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because my father had given me the resources to honor the woman Lydia had spent 2 decades diminishing. I found more recordings after the will reading. My father had left them in a safety deposit box with a note that said, "Grace, I should have done this 20 years ago, but I'm doing it now." I documented every cruel comment, every dismissal, every time they made you feel small, because I wanted proof that this decision wasn't made in anger. It was made with full knowledge of who these people are, and I'm sorry I didn't protect you when you were young, but I'm protecting you now. And I sat in the bank reading that note, and I cried because my father had been watching the whole time, and he'd been planning this, and I wasn't finishing my revenge, I was finishing his. Lydia tried to contest the will, but the recordings made it impossible. Her attorney heard the clips and told her she had no case, and she dropped it, and I haven't spoken to her or my stepsisters since, and I don't plan to, because the relationship was built on a lie, and my father's will was the truth. If you've ever been the child who didn't belong, if you've been called someone else's obligation or told you weren't really family, I need you to know that the people who see your worth don't always say it out loud sometimes. They document it, and they plan, and they make sure that when they're gone, you're protected. And my father spent his last years making sure I knew I mattered, and that's a gift I didn't know I needed. And this inheritance wasn't about money. It was about him finally saying out loud what he should have said 20 years ago, which is that I was his daughter and I was enough, and no one gets to take that away.